Hello, and thanks for stopping by. Moored on the Thames between London Bridge and Tower Bridge, HMS Belfast is one of the capital's most unique landmarks, a huge floating museum with an extraordinary battle-hardened past. This formidable ship has ploughed through freezing Arctic waters and survived a devastating mine strike. She was among the first ships to fire the opening shots on D-Day, and in the 1950s went on to serve in the Korean War. In this video, I'd like to take you on a tour of HMS Belfast, exploring her incredible history, guiding you through her labyrinth of decks, and giving you a sense of what it was like to sail aboard her. I'll also show you the exact spot upon which her huge guns are permanently trained. It may not be what you expect. When boarding HMS Belfast, you approach via this gangway, above which are markers denoting the many parts of the world which she sailed to. During her 25 years at sea, Belfast covered around 500,000 miles, roughly the distance to the moon and back. The first place we come to is the quarterdeck, where you can see the ship's Belle. This was gifted to the ship in 1948 by the good people of Belfast, for as the ship's name suggests, she was indeed built in Belfast by the famous shipbuilders Harland and Wolff, who also built the ill-fated RMS Titanic. Fortunately, HMS Belfast, which was assigned job number 1000 when ordered in 1936, was far more blessed than the Titanic. Anne Chamberlain, wife of then Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, launched the ship on the 17th of March 1938, St Patrick's Day. It's perhaps no surprise therefore that HMS Belfast was said to have the luck of the Irish, and indeed, as we'll soon see, this good fortune saw her crew through many perilous waters. HMS Belfast, which cost around £2.1 million to build in 1930s money, is classed as a light cruiser, specifically a town-class cruiser, one of 10 built for the Royal Navy, each of which was named after a British city, the others being Southampton, Newcastle, Sheffield, Glasgow, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Gloucester, and Edinburgh. The town-class cruisers were fast, manoeuvrable ships, and although their 6-inch and 4-inch guns were smaller than those found on a battleship, they were still heavily armed and capable of delivering considerable firepower. Over the years, HMS Belfast underwent several refits, meaning the ship we see today is largely how it would have appeared to those serving aboard her in the 1950s and early 60s. Following her launch, kitting out and sea trials, HMS Belfast was commissioned into the Royal Navy on the 5th of August 1939, right on the eve of the Second World War. Her first commander was Captain George Arthur Scott. This is the captain's bridge, from where he would have overseen things. When acting as a flagship, HMS Belfast could also accommodate an admiral and his staff. So above the captain's bridge, there's an admiral's bridge too, from where the rest of the fleet could be directed. It's said that Winston Churchill, always keen to be at the heart of the action, intended to watch the D-Day invasion from the admiral's bridge on HMS Belfast. Fortunately, he was talked out of this extremely dangerous idea by King George VI, who insisted that if Churchill were to do that, then he'd have no choice but to join him. Back on the captain's bridge, you may be surprised to see that there's no ship's wheel. That's because the wheelhouse sits down below, deep within Belfast, at a location designed to offer some protection in the heat of battle. As you can see, there are no portholes down here. The required bearings would be called down by an officer on the bridge, and the helmsman would steer accordingly. It must have been a rather disorientating job. HMS Belfast's first role in World War II was to enforce a naval blockade of Germany. To aid reconnaissance, the ship at that time was home to 2 Supermarine Walrus aircraft, which were launched from the deck by a catapult. Once ready to return, these little craft would land on water and then be hoisted back on board by one of the ship's 2 cranes. They were withdrawn from the ship in 1943. During the blockade, on the 9th of October 1939, HMS Belfast captured the SS Cap Norte, which had attempted to disguise itself as a Swedish liner called the SS Ancona. Belfast's sharp-eyed crew noticed that the ship's real name had been painted over. It was a good day for the crew, as thanks to the Admiralty's prize of war rules, it meant they received a cash bonus. That money, along with regular pay, leave papers, and other official documents, would have been handed out from here, the ship's regulating office. Unfortunately, HMS Belfast's early war service was cut short when she was struck by a magnetic mine on the 21st of November 1939, whilst leaving the Firth of Forth. The blast, which occurred just below this spot, injured 21 men and caused severe damage. Damage that was so extensive, in fact, it was feared the ship would have to be scrapped. In the end though, it was decided she was worth saving, and so was taken to Plymouth's Devonport dockyard for a major overhaul. It took 3 years to repair HMS Belfast, but once recommissioned in November 1942, she came back even stronger than before. Now, under the command of Captain Frederick Parham, she was tasked with escorting the Arctic Convoys, fleets of merchant ships travelling to and from the Soviet Union with vital war equipment such as tanks, aircraft and ammunition. Conditions on the Arctic Convoys, which were protected by ships from the Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy and the US Navy, were the stuff of nightmares. Operating in winter, when it was almost constantly dark, there were gale-force winds and waves up to 35 feet high. Temperatures could plunge to minus 40 degrees Celsius, caking vessels in thick layers of ice. This ice was lethal, for the weight of it was enough to put a ship at risk of capsizing, and so it had to be regularly chiselled off. That in itself brought a new danger. Any exposed skin coming into contact with metal would instantly fuse to the surface. Treacherous weather aside, there was also the threat of enemy attack, both from the aircraft of the Luftwaffe and, below water, the dreaded U-boats. In all, HMS Belfast served for 18 months on the Arctic Convoys. During that period, the warmest place to be, albeit one that was noisy and choked with fumes, would have been down below, in the boiler and engine rooms. Although having said that, when Belfast was in hotter climates, such as the Far East, this was the worst place to be. As a junior stoker named Ted Hill later recalled, it was like taking a step into hell. HMS Belfast's boilers burned oil to produce steam, which in turn powered 4 turbines, driving 4 propellers. Spread across 2 levels, the boilers and engines have to be seen to be believed, a bewildering tangle of pipes, gangways, valves and dials. On a lighter note, this industrial setting has, in the past, made for the perfect artistic backdrop. In 1984, Depeche Mode filmed the video for People Are People Down Here, and in July 1980, Spandau Ballet played a famous early gig on board Belfast too. Altogether, this impressive engineering gave HMS Belfast a top speed of 32.5 knots, roughly 37 miles per hour, which is pretty impressive considering that, when fully loaded, she weighed 14,900 tons. When at peak capacity, HMS Belfast was home to around 800 to 900 men. Most of a sailor's day-to-day life would have been spent here, on the main deck, where the majority of amenities could be found. This is the galley, where meals were prepared around the clock. There was a separate bakery too, which, as well as providing bread for Belfast, catered for nearby ships too. Ingredients were stored close to the galley and bakery, although items with a strong odour, such as soap and tobacco, were stored on the lower deck. Those items, along with other things such as chocolate, magazines and razor blades, were sold from this unit, the NAFI canteen, NAFI standing for Navy, Army and Air Force Institutes. If you had the misfortune to suffer a toothache whilst at sea, there was a dental surgery on board. And for more serious issues, a small but well-equipped sick bay, complete with an X-ray machine and small operating theatre. The sick bay was manned by 3 medical officers and 6 orderlies, who cared for patients, both friendly and enemy. A large number of people wounded both on D-Day and during the Korean War were treated here. Elsewhere on the main deck, you can see the small chapel, one of the only places a crewman could find some degree of peace and solitude, and the sound reproduction equipment room, from where music and popular radio shows were piped around the ship. There was a little library too, along with a clothing store, and, perhaps most importantly, the provision issue room, from where the daily rum ration would be handed out, an understandably very popular tradition which continued in the Royal Navy until 1970. There was a laundry on board as well, although this wasn't added until the 1950s. Prior to that, sailors had to scrub their own clothes and equipment with a bucket and bar of soap. Once established, the laundry on HMS Belfast was operated by a group of Chinese civilians from Hong Kong. Sadly, it was one of the ship's Chinese stewards, leading steward Lao So, who became the only crew member to be killed on board HMS Belfast by enemy action. This occurred during the Korean War, when the ship was struck by a shell in August 1952. In accordance with the wishes of his Chinese colleagues, Lao So's body was taken ashore under cover of darkness and buried on an island, which happens to be part of North Korea. As for sleeping, most of the men on board, and the ship's cat, kipped wherever they could in hammocks. Above the tables in the mess deck was a popular spot, as was the capstan flat, the capstans being the equipment used to lower and raise the ship's hefty 5-ton anchors. Once a spot was chosen, you'd set up your hammock in accordance with Navy regulations and then perform a pull-up in order to swing yourself in. Not easy considering hammocks were slung in rows just 52 centimetres apart. It was also by the capstan that HMS Belfast's 2 punishment cells are located. Discipline was of course of the utmost importance on board, and you could end up in one of these cells for up to 14 days for crimes such as insubordination, sleeping on watch, smuggling liquor aboard, and much more. Once shut away in here, comforts such as books and razors were forbidden, although a copy of the Bible was permitted. As you can see, there are no windows in the cells, the only link to the outside world being this tiny spy hole on the door. Senior ratings had somewhat more practical bedding, namely these bunks stacked 3 high. The captain and officers meanwhile had far more private cabins located close to the bridge. Thanks largely to the work of the top-secret code breaking carried out at Bletchley Park, the Arctic Convoys became adept at dealing with enemy vessels, so much so that in November 1943, 5 convoys, 3 eastbound and 2 westbound, were able to make the perilous journey without losing a single vessel. In response, the German Navy dispatched one of their most powerful ships, the Scharnhorst, to hunt down two particular convoys as they crossed paths, one en route from Britain, the other returning from the Soviet Union. Scharnhorst was put to sea on Christmas Day 1943, and again, thanks to the efforts of the codebreakers, the Royal Navy were quickly able to arrange their ships accordingly, seizing the chance to destroy one of the enemy's greatest assets. What followed would become known as the Battle of the North Cape. At 8:14 AM on Boxing Day, HMS Belfast detected Scharnhorst on her radar. A series of engagements between the German ship and those of the Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Royal Norwegian Navy ensued over the following hours, all in Arctic darkness, illuminated by star shells. During the battle, Belfast fired a number of powerful broadsides at the Scharnhorst, along with launching a torpedo. The mighty ship was finally sunk sometime after 7:30 PM, with the loss of 1,932 souls, a dreadful death in freezing oil-slicked waters. Of the German crew, only 36 survived. Some months later, in June 1944, HMS Belfast would go on to serve another crucial role, this time as part of Operation Neptune, the naval component of Operation Overlord, D-Day. At 5:27 AM on the 6th of June, HMS Belfast fired one of the opening salvos of D-Day, bombarding targets on the Normandy coast, in order to clear the way for the thousands of troops who'd shortly be storming the beaches. This barrage continued for several hours, the powerful guns shaking the ship and her crew to the very core. So much so that the heads, the naval term for lavatories, were shattered to pieces. With that in mind, now's a good time to take a closer look at HMS Belfast's formidable guns. The most prominent are these two large turrets, Turret A, lower, and Turret B, upper. The 6 guns seen here were each capable of firing 8 rounds per minute, to a distance of 14 miles. And ever since HMS Belfast was docked here in the early 1970s, they've been permanently aimed at the London Gateway services, formerly known as Scratchwood services, on the M1 motorway, between Edgware and Elstree. So yes, HMS Belfast is capable of lobbing a shell right into this very car park. It took 200 men to keep all of Belfast's guns firing. The process began high up, on the gun direction platform, where information would be sent down to the transmitting station, essentially an early computer, which worked out the exact angles required. This data would then be sent to the large turrets, inside which 26 men would be crammed to operate the actual guns. The shells and cordite charges required to fire them were sent up from the shell room far below, one room for each turret, where the shells would slowly rotate around carousels before being whisked up to the turret on hoists. The smaller 4-inch guns, meanwhile, provided a powerful force in their own right. These required 15 gunners each to operate, and could fire 20 rounds per minute. Used for anti-aircraft fire, they could shoot up to 39,000 feet. And if firing at targets on land, their range was 12 miles. HMS Belfast remained in almost constant action for several weeks after D-Day, firing thousands of rounds towards the coast. Then, in 1945, she headed for East Asia, where the fight was expected to continue, although before she arrived, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought a swift, brutal end to the war. Nevertheless, there was still important work to be done in that part of the world, namely evacuating the many men who'd been Japanese prisoners of war, along with civilian families who'd been held at internment camps in Shanghai. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, HMS Belfast sailed into battle once again. In this role, she blockaded the North Korean coast and shelled targets on shore in support of the American and South Korean forces. In fact, her guns were fired more in Korea than they had been throughout the whole of World War II, and so effective was her weaponry, the US forces affectionately nicknamed Belfast the Straight Shooting Ship. Following the Korean War, HMS Belfast maintained a peacetime role. She was given a final overhaul in 1959, and then retired on the 24th of August 1963. At the time, it appeared Belfast's next port of call would be the scrapyard. Although fortunately, a group led by her former and most recent captain, now Rear Admiral Sir Morgan Giles, clubbed together to save her and transform her into a museum. A fund was established, and in October 1971, HMS Belfast was towed into London, making her way through a raised Tower Bridge. Amongst the many people lined along the river to witness the event was Ron Yardley, who'd served on HMS Belfast during Korea. As he later recalled, "I just stood there and wept. My old home had just come back again." Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tour of HMS Belfast, and as always, I'd love to hear your own thoughts. Have you clambered aboard this wonderful ship yourself? Or better yet, do you have a relative who served aboard her? If so, please do be sure to let me know in the comments. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out on any future videos. Plus of course, it'd be wonderful to have you along. And if you enjoyed this film, you can also give it a little boost by clicking the YouTube hype button below. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well, and please be sure to stay tuned.